Hi, everybody. This is Marilyn, CEO and founder of Cosmic Centaurs, and just back from our trip to Riyadh, where we had the most amazing masterclass on Tuesday night with Mr. Yasser Joherji. Every single thing he said was quote worthy. I promised him a t-shirt line. We'll hopefully be able to publish that soon for all of you to witness. Now, if you don't know who we are, we're Cosmic Centaurs, a leadership development and organizational development consultancy. We help intentional and holistic leaders make better decisions about work and the workplace and affect sustainable change. Today, you're joining us for our online event. I think it's the fourth of this year's edition of the Cosmic Conference, and it's part of a 2-month-long conference all about leadership polarities titled The Cosmic Dance, Mastering Dualities in Leadership. We've been running this conference for 5 years now because one of our principles is sharing what we learn with the world. And every year we try to choose a theme that we think will resonate with the leaders that we work with. And this year we've chosen what I believe to be a timeless theme to help leaders master a key skill for navigating a complex world, the topic of polarities. All leaders, whether they've been in the C-suite for decades or first-time managers, are constantly navigating seemingly opposing demands, present and future, engaging your people but demanding performance, running a company that is high growth but also profitable, and the list goes on. And great leaders know that their superpower comes from having range. This ability to dance along the spectrum is what drives sustainable organizational growth. They go from the either-or mentality that traditional education teaches us to a both-and mentality that allows them to thrive in a complex world. Today, our guest, Gayle Karen Young, will explore the essential polarities organizations face in shaping their strategies and culture and how to leverage these tensions to foster an organization that thrives. I will introduce her in just a second, but I will also say to all of you joining us here today, Karen's going to be presenting her thoughts on the topic for a little bit, call it about 20 minutes. And then after that, join me and ask all of your questions in the comments because we'll be having a conversation about all the things we're going to learn through her intervention. Now, let me introduce her real quick. Gayle is an executive coach and partner at Cultivating Leadership. She is a cultural architect, a word very dear to my heart, and a catalyst for human and organizational development. She comes from a rich organizational consulting background with both corporate and nonprofit clients. She was in the process of becoming a Zen monk when she became an executive instead, taking on the role of Chief Culture and Talent Officer at the Wikimedia Foundation, until early 2015 when she joined Cultivating Leadership. From high-level strategic thinking to practical implementation, her skills include leadership development, change management, facilitation, training, strategic comms, and the list goes on. Gayle, like us, believes the world needs more leaders who are able for what lies ahead, who've developed the capacity to meet the complexity of global challenges. She believes in meeting people and systems where they are and then developing them to work with the full range of who they are. Gayle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be with you. When I met you, I thought it's so lovely to meet good allies in this work that we do about having organizations be fundamentally more effective. And so when I meet new friends, I think, how are we good allies in this work that we do? And I appreciate you referencing a bit of my background, and I'll say a little tiny bit more. I came into this study, I'm a psychologist by training, and I started that because I thought, why are we so weird as human beings? Why do we do strange things to one another? How is it that we manage to communicate anything at all across lines of race and gender and difference and background and the different life experiences that we have? So I'm fascinated by human beings. I'm also fascinated by human potential. I'm a big science fiction fan and a technologist. I've been fascinated for decades about what technology enables. And so, and I'm also interested in this, what is the development and relationship between consciousness and technology, which is something in this world of AI that is very, very present. And so I was studying to be a Zen monk, and hysterically, I'm back in the study of Zen chaplaincy, this commitment to ongoing development. And I just want to say welcome to everybody on the line. I love roomies, come, whoever you are, wanderers, worshipers, lovers of leaving. Ours is not a caravan of despair. This Cosmic Centaurs engagement is not a caravan of despair. And what you framed up so beautifully around the tensions that we need to hold and navigate dynamically between them in order to be successful as leaders is something I care deeply about. I like real take your well-disciplined strengths and stretch them between two great opposing poles, because inside human beings is where God learns. So I'm happy to dive into the content. Thank you for having me.
Over to you. Thank you, Gayle.
Yes. So we're going to play with the mythic and the mundane today. And that I want to start by saying our oldest allies have been the earth that we walk and the sky overhead. The environments around us have always put us in relationship between ground and horizon. Charles Pasternak, who is this beautiful biologist, talks about how the human propensity to quest is part of what has spurred our evolution as human beings. And so between the mythic and the mundane, we are, as human beings, a bridge between them. We generate through our imaginative capacity this ability to make what we conceive of as real. I particularly love the composer Stephen Sondheim, who has these fabulous lyrics in relation to being a creative and an artist and a leader. Look, I made a hat where there never was a hat. That's what we're doing. When I was at Wikipedia, we ran Wikipedia in 500 different languages, each with their own government structure. So I was curious about the complexity of that, but the dream that we had behind it was making the sum total of human knowledge available to anyone from everywhere for free. Pixar was another client of mine, crafting these beautiful narratives that are meant, these stories that have never existed before, that are meant to emotionally move people. Nike has been a client. And, when you think about Nike and you think about the brand, it's not about the shoe, right? It's about the athlete. It's about winning. It's a particular dream. And they were prominent in the Olympics, right? And this movement between ground and horizon plays out in our organizational life, between the mythic and the mundane. And this is something that's really important for any leader, for each of you. Part of your role is being that of culture bearer, culture crafter, in order to have a culture that is capable of fulfilling your strategy. And I liken culture to being the dark matter of the universe, right? The stuff that profoundly affects in really strange ways the shape of the cosmos, but is fundamentally invisible. But if you're a leader who is not attending to this dark, invisible matter, it can absolutely tank your strategy or vision. I've seen this with founders before who sometimes say to me, why don't my people just do X? I'm like, well, the conditions aren't there for them to do so. So this work of minding the invisible, this weaving together the visible, the invisible, the mythic and the mundane, the vision and strategy, is part of what we need to have the capabilities to actually fulfill what we're doing. Lucille Clifton, who is another poet that I absolutely love, talks about, here on this bridge between starshine and clay, I made it up. As a leader, you are that bridge between starshine and clay. You are making the thing and you are inviting people onto that bridge with you. Like Miriam with Cosmic Centaurs, like Cosmic Centaurs didn't exist before you created it. And now it does. And now you've invited people into this vision you have of working with you in order to make workplaces more effective. So there are 1,000 ways I can talk about the dualities that we hold as individuals, as groups, but I'm going to talk about 2 systems level ones. And we talked about culture and strategy, because these are 2 big organizational elements where these polarities are at play. And we'll start with the one on culture. So with culture, one of the dynamics that's super fascinating to me is that you need a culture that has enough coherence, enough alignment, enough internal integrity, that you have strength and throughput and capacity. And you need enough dissonance for positive deviance, for the ability of the organization to not just default to normative, but to create change in a positive direction. And I'll talk a little bit about cultural coherence. And this also impacts your strategy, by the way, because if you have high coherence, you have a stronger organizational culture. You have better decision making because you know what people are aligned towards. You have better collaboration and teamwork because people are sharing a shared value set, a shared set of norms. And this gives you room to be adaptable, to be accountable to your stakeholders, and have a great reputation. And part of what I mean by coherence, we are so sensitive to incoherence on some level, right? If you're an environmental company and you use disposable everything, like we're sensitive to what I call unintentional, hopefully unintentional, organizational hypocrisy, right? So you want a high degree of coherence. If you care about renewable energy and you are funding things that are not in renewable energy, people are sensitive to those dissonances, right? And when you have low coherence, when you have a lot of those dissonances, people spend far more time and energy than they should or that they need to trying to reconcile what those differences are. And that's part of what contributes to burnout, to decreased trust, reputational damage, and fundamentally to a sort of toxicity and moral injury. I could spend a lot more time thinking about that. So you need enough coherence, right? That you get the gains of a coherent culture that's aligned your strategy. But again, you need enough dissonance to creatively navigate. Because when you think about the bell curve, for example, people kind of collapse to dissonance. What do we do when people are outside of our norms? We try to make them fit back in. And yet when you're trying to evolve towards excellence, what you want to do is have people who are able to operate in amazing ways outside those norms towards excellence, towards that positive deviance. And part of the way that you encourage that is figuring out within your organizational culture, what does that mythic and mundane really look like? You know, if you have on the mythic level, you have your vision, you have your mission, you have your values, you have the stories, you have your origin story about how you were founded. We are storytelling beings fundamentally. So we need that capability to tell a story about who you are, what you do in ways that engage and enroll and invite people onto that bridge between starshine and clay, right? But the places of building alignment need to live in the areas of organizational structure and leadership. You know, if you talk a lot about equality and collaboration, yeah, you have a super hierarchical organizational structure that creates dissonance, right? If you care about maternal policy, and yet if you care about women's rights and you don't have good maternal policy, that creates dissonance, right? And then you need to make sure your resource allocation is aligned to the vision you have. So at Wikipedia, we talked a lot about getting more women editors, but we didn't fund it sometimes to the necessity that it was that we needed to in order to have alignment to our strategy. So everything needs to be aligned all the way to the level of resource allocation. And yet we're also asking people to do more with less, to be really creative, to pursue excellence. And that, again, requires that capacity for positive deviance. So that's a distinct polarity that you need to hold. And I could talk a lot about more of these, but I want to be mindful of our time and actually also get to both strategy and get to questions as well. So we talked a little bit about how even coherence is actually part of strategic capability. But one of the things that as you're thinking about strategy that you need to be considering is having strategic directionality. So having a sense of where you're going, what you're about, where you're moving to, that horizon line that we're talking about. When I originally mentioned the deep relationship that we as human beings have to both horizon and ground, right? So we need enough directionality to invite people into a shared future. And we need an incredible capacity in complex systems for emergence. We need to be paying attention to what's going around us, where the different things can be coming in from, that we have enough adaptability and frankly slack within an organizational system so that you have a responsive ability to react to emergence. And the big collective example that we have for this is COVID, of course. Like, people did not expect the changes to supply chain, to organizational behaviors, to working conditions that emerged during COVID. And so organizations that were successful in being able to adapt to COVID were organizations that had an ability to be attentive to what was going on and had a sense of where we were going and what they offered, but not so locked in rigidly that they weren't able to have this ability to dance and adapt to emergence. So that's one thing that I'll name about strategy. Another important thing that I want to name about strategy is that every organization is going to have a few particular dynamic polarities that they're having to navigate between that sort of defines your organization. So one of them, for example, for Nike is between sport, the primacy of the athletes, and being a lifestyle brand, the same kind of thing where you could throw on a Nike sweatshirt and go to the grocery, right? And it's between these two things, there's a dynamic tension that exists, right? At Pixar, one of the ones that we talked about was, really enabling the storytellers. So there's a strategic direction in there. But the technology arm of Pixar is really invested in a technology that helps storyboarding change up until the very, very last minute. So previous models of architecting Pixar movies would exist in the realm of having storyboards that were locked and loaded, and then you could design all of the different frames, and each of the frames had incredible complexity to them. Like, you haven't spent time necessarily, unless you happen to be in the animation business, thinking about how much attention goes into making sure that the shadows fall correctly for things moving across the screen. Next time you watch an animated film, notice the shadowing. So this dynamic tension holds between the rigidity and coherence and the faithfulness to a storyline, and yet needing the adaptability enabled by technology to enable that storyline to responsively change up until that last moment based on audience testing, right? And so you want the storytellers to tell the stories, but part of what we know is that we need audience input. We need to see how you respond to the stories being told. And that responsiveness and adaptability to that is part of what created the magic that Pixar was able to deliver to the large screen. At Wikipedia, part of what we talked about, one of our core polarities was between privacy, really standing for the non-commercialization of user data, and also transparency at scale, which is part of the reason that Wikipedia is, 3% of all the large language models used in AI at the moment, right? This ability to make things open and transparent and grabbable by the largest possible set of use cases and audience while still standing for user privacy. We had another dynamic core strategic tension that we played out between our faithfulness to the 500,000 users a month who are using the site and the need for it to be somewhat accessible, not just to people in wealthy countries, but people who had to access Wikipedia in narrow bandwidth on their phones. And so that was the user side, but we also had to have a fidelity to the 100,000 active contributors who are using their cognitive surplus and essentially donating it to the site to create the knowledge that's on Wikipedia. So every organization is going to have this dynamic tension between a few core strategic tensions that you need to be faithful to. So your ability to figure out what those are for yourself, and then to create the conditions and have the cultural coherence while rewarding that positive deviance, is part of what will craft a culture and strategy that is successful and viable and flourishing. And the particular vantage point that you as leaders need to have to be able to do that is so important. Part of what I'm trying to do is offer you language and ability to pay attention, to attend in a different way. And so the very last thing that I want to talk about in our conversation today, and what I hope will be more of a conversation, is about your attention. And so your ability to attend, to be able to widen and narrow the aperture of your own attention, is one of the most important capacities internally that you can hold, right? So we've talked about these big things, culture, strategy, and I want to just take it back to the personal for a moment in this dynamic tension. We live in a world with what one of my Zen teachers calls the 3Ds: divided, distracted, dispersed, right? Our minds are landscaped by the 1,000 things that grab our attention. I am guessing that a number of you listening are multitasking right now. This is part of the way that we are. But the ability to play between narrow focus and the long view, between being on the dance floor and moving and navigating around people all the time and figuring out how to go there, and then being able to get on the balcony of your own leadership and your own ability to see what's going on and take a balcony perspective is so important. And so this crafting, this cultivation of your attention and being able to encompass what is near in your focus, like right in front of you, and then to widen the aperture to the far horizon and help the people around you do that move is one of the most prime disciplines that you can cultivate in yourself as a leader that will help you do that shaping, that minding the invisible, that standing on that bridge between starshine and clay. So I want to pause here and actually shift this from me talking at you into dialogue with Marilyn, and hopefully some of you have questions as well that you're curious about and that you might want to follow.
Thank you, Gayle. That was beautiful. Actually, not only the ideas, but also your way of delivering is an invitation to really pause and be present. So thank you so much for that. I have a billion questions, and there's a few from the audience as well.
Great.
I'm gonna go back and follow the structure of what you shared with us here today, and I want to go back to the concept of coherence versus positive deviance.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen so many examples of the dissonance that you were talking about, where you say that you stand for something, but if I look between the lines, if I look at how certain behaviors or what we allow or don't allow here, dissonance is evident. So I really understand that concept quite well. And I also understand, in opposition to it, the coherence piece that you were talking about. But talk to me a bit more about positive deviance, because I can speak for myself within my own organization. I see myself as a carrier and a architect. I really love that word, of the culture of our organization, and also as sometimes the policeman of that culture, right?
Yeah.
What is positive deviance, and how can I know that I'm creating space for it?
Part of what positive deviance is, so what part of what culture does, like from a kind of anthropological lens, like why do we have culture, right? We like predictability. We like a sense of belonging. Like people long for a sense, I am part of this. And it's like we like to recognize that, oh, you belong too. Oh, you also like dogs. Oh, you also, believe this thing that I do. And so we want that, right? But what we know is that to be creative, um, there's a great phrase that I'm trying to remember that has to do like when a situation is really complex, when we're dealing with inordinate complexity, and we all are. Let's just be real. Like there's so many things coming at us: geopolitical, governmental, social change at scale, etc. Part of what you want is you want to generate an appropriate number of responses for the complexity that you face. And so the creative aspect, the beauty of us as human beings is we're creative, we're like, we're making a hat where there never was a hat, And so in order to generate the level of responses and creative responses and innovative responses that meet the complexity of a circumstance at hand, we actually need deviance, we need dissonance, we need difference. But we don't need it to be destructive, right? And so part of the way that you nudge culture, so nobody is perfectly coherent, right? We all are inconsistent. Like every parent knows that you have a set of beliefs about how you would like to raise your children and the ways that you actually show up, especially when you're a little under-resourced, right? Whether you haven't slept enough or haven't, we all live out those dissonances, which is why I say you need enough coherence. Not we are all on a journey, and there's no perfection in any of this. But part of the way you know it is like when someone does something and it moves the culture in a positive direction, how do you double down and reinforce that? How do you tell stories about it? How do you reward it? How do you amplify the volume of it so that you can nudge that along in a positive direction, right? So moments of extraordinary, moments of difference, even moments of extraordinary that don't necessarily feel, but it's like, oh, that's not how we do things. But wait, should it be how we do things? You know?
So what
So
you're saying that it's less about creating the conditions for deviance like ahead of, but rather that when it does occur, because inevitably it will, that you don't double down on being the police and that you hesitate and say, wait, maybe we are learning something new. Maybe this is a new way of being or behaving or thinking or creating. Is that
that
how?
is that is the creating the conditions. So the way that you create conditions in a particular system is by drawing attention to some things and not putting attention on other things. This is why attention is as the last piece that I ended on.
Mm.
And you don't need to pause for very long, pause for a moment,
Sure.
because some things really should be policed, like bad behavior, like toxic behavior, taking people down, too much micro. So those behaviors really, really, that really quash creativity. Um, and you need to be. This is a part of being contextually mindful as well, right? Like in an innovation environment, you want to really encourage creativity. I'm not sure that you want to encourage that much creativity in, say, a regulatory environment where you're producing airplane parts. So, like,
Sure.
if I'm Boeing and I want to produce like really excellent bolts that are going to put my airline, I want rigor there, right?
Mm.
And so maybe what I would reward is innovations and rigor, but I'm not going to particularly reward like, hey, I've just thought of this new thing on the supply chain that I'm going to do today, and throw everybody else off. Like, that's not the the noticing and attention of the place
Mm.
to really encourage positive deviance is part of the crafting the conditions for an organizational culture that, yeah, that really works.
I appreciate that. And I think something I always say is, obviously I'm still a work in progress, but I've spent a lot of time building a kind of what I would call a reverse trigger in my mind, which is that it is when I am most certain of how we should behave that I stop to hesitate, because I feel that that's when I fall into defaulting rather than being intentional about. And it's the moment where I am absolutely sure of the way forward, where I stop myself and I say, actually, maybe you're wrong. And it's in the moments where someone, begins to voice something. And Marie on my team will tell you this. Like, for example, she's so different from me that the second she voices what begins to sound like a disagreement, I shut up, which it took me years to develop that capacity, of course. I shut up and I listen, is what I mean to say. But I think, like, for me, practically, it's just sounded like that. It sounded like there are these moments that are like, you could completely ignore them and never notice them. But if you teach yourself to respond to them differently than what you're defaulting to, then maybe that's how you can invite these things.
Such a beautiful example. One, the noticing, and two, the naming, the reverse trigger, the noticing, the antecedent, and having it positively reinforced the possibility that opened up as a consequence of your choosing not to go with just your default behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. There's quite a few questions from the audience. I want to get to one that I think is really good at this moment. And then we're going to talk about the mythic and the mundane, because there's questions there and I have a few.
Okay.
The question here says, it sounds like storytelling is a core capability that leaders should develop for the many reasons that you reference. And have you seen leaders who may feel this does not come naturally to them develop this skill? And if so, how?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I have many leaders who, we are not, I think some cultures are slightly better at storytelling than others. Like, I love being in Ireland because I feel like people there are just like, have the gift of the Irish gab. But part of the way that we can develop our own capacity to storytelling, well, first practice, to watch really good storytellers and actually take the time to dissect it. Like, what worked there about that? What didn't work? Where did that person lose people? And what kept them riveted? And practice in safe to fail ways, practice we tell stories all the time. We call up our girlfriend, or we have a dinner and we talk about that family member who did X. But practice a little bit more brevity and a little bit more punchiness, and that practice and that inclination over time will grow. So it's absolutely a skill that can be learned. I have worked with some of the most phenomenal storytellers. Steven Spielberg is a dear friend and client of mine as well, and I love working with him because he's such a brilliant storyteller, and he has honed that gift over time. And you can see, if you watch the movie The Fabelmans, you can see the beginning of the development of that gift. So I highly encourage them, because it's a pretty accurate view, despite being called The Fabelmans, of his origin and life story. So pay attention to the storytellers and see how they do it. It's absolutely learnable.
Love that. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I am definitely someone who's been very intentional about developing that skill. And it's those hours of practice. It's watching people you love and noticing their pauses, their silences, their structures. And by the way, like, there's a lot of thinking around the fact that there are like 7 key story structures that are underlying every good story. Like, the nice thing about being a storyteller is some of it is charisma, and sure, it's like how you speak and how you pause and so on. But also a lot of the story structure stuff, there are good practices there. So there's a lot of great content to start from. Okay, I want us to talk about, and so does the audience, about this mythic and mundane piece. You went through it really fast, and I want us to pause on it for a bit. I think there's something very beautiful and also very coherent in that sense about, between the sky and the ground, in the mythic and the mundane, in making all of these things kind of feel aligned, and to give the same level of importance to the big symbolic stuff as you do to the small details. I have a story that I always tell, and maybe I'll share it with you, and then I just want you to resonate. Let's make this into a discussion that way. So I always share this story about, I studied architecture, and we once had someone from, I think it was Renzo Piano's office, who's like, he's like the Taylor Swift of architecture, for those who have no idea who that might be. And they came in, and I hope I got it right. I think it was them. And they were talking to us about the Hermes building. In Tokyo, Japan, there's this street where all of the luxury brands have like their flagship stores, and each one is more beautiful than the next. And they had designed the Hermes building there, and they had this whole concept for it. And it was a lantern, and it was referring a lot of elements of Japanese culture. And it was just like a very beautiful conceptual building. And then the guy spent all this time talking to us about like every architectural detail that they had to figure out in order to like make this concept, bring it to life. And I'll never forget that at some point in that discussion, he shared with us that in that project was the time where they decided that the screws on the inside of the bathroom stalls would no longer use a cross section, but would be replaced by a hexagonal one, because you can never align 2 screws with a cross section. It's practically impossible. And I'll never forget this as like such a beautiful, I mean, to me at least, but you can tell me whether that's a good story, as this like beautiful idea, even what you said at the end, like that fifth, zooming out and zooming in, of like being able to master a craft all the way up here, from like the conceptual references and metaphors that you're trying to bring to life, all the way down to the screw in the bathroom. I really love to tell this story, and I don't know if that's a good way.
No, it's a fabulous story, and I love it because it brings in the very tangible and tactile. You're talking fundamentally about the building. You're talking about the back of the bathroom stall doors, and people might not never know it, but they will feel the level of attention that was paid. Like, you will walk down the street, or you will enter that building, and there's so many buildings that I've entered. You will, there's a beautiful Michael Murphy is an architect here in the States. He says design is not neutral, and so. And this is again a point of attention. Pay attention to what places feel like, and then know that somebody has had to pay attention to the very tangibility. And even if you don't have it yourself, you can grow it in your team, right? So, like, I am we're in the process of redesigning the Cultivating Leadership website. And so I can talk about how I want it to feel. I want it to be invitational. I want it to be beautiful. I want it to evoke both a sense of welcome, but I also want it to feel like attention was paid into it. But I am not the person that you want necessarily being like, and then we should do this font, I mean, I do care about fonts. Let's be real about that. But you want to both have some ability to balance, but you also want to surround yourself with people who can, so that you can, as a collective, be able to pay attention to both of these things, right? And you want that alignment between those two things, right? So if the person, the architect that you're talking about, had built this beautiful thing, how much would it have hurt to have people working for that person who really didn't care about the bathroom stalls? And you've been in places where the facade is super beautiful, and you open the door and you look inside and you're like, what happened here? Right. This is not what the interior was supposed to look like. And sometimes we know people like that too. People sometimes spend a lot on their facades, and then you meet them and I'm like, oh honey, your interior is also beautiful. Pay some attention to that as well. So this does scales all the way up and all the way down. I love to ask people, what were you born in this life in this time to do? How are you the hero of your own story? And to let yourself be placed in the primacy of that, because nobody is walking this planet the way you are at this time with your life experiences. And at the same time, then you get to zoom out and be like, you're not the only person on this planet walking through with your own life experiences. So you need to realize that you are in interaction, in interbeing with the constellation of people, systems around you, and that being part of your job is to also be fit for purpose.
I love that. Actually, our speaker the other day said something very similar to what you're saying. He said, we are each a creation of God. And, in a spiritual way, it resonates with what you're saying. Right. Do you have, there's a question from the audience, and I had a similar question in my mind, which is like, practically, how do you create space for the mythic and the mundane? And I would say, do you have stories of companies where you saw alignment between those two that are particularly close to your heart?
I'll go back to Pixar because they're a really fun one, the animation company. And I if you haven't seen their movies, they work as well for adults and for leaders as they do. Yeah, it's good to know. But the story is beginning to tell is like there's when you walk into their offices, there's such a spirit of play in them. It's a fun office to be in because play is encouraged. People are encouraged to learn actively, to experience, because if you're going to make stories that emotionally resonate with people, you're encouraged to have the full range of your own life experiences and to make sense of them and to play. And there's color and there's sight and sound. So the artifacts do matter, right? But then it gets down to as I said, the very technical detail of how do the shadows and when do they get applied? And at what point in the movie making structure, in the film structure, does that level of detail provide a coherence? Because you would know at a deep intuitive level when something was off. I'm going to take a tiny segue. Every single one of you listening to this knows the difference between hot water being poured and cold water being poured out. And I'll bet you didn't even know that you knew that. Some of you might. But seriously, have somebody pour out a pitcher of hot water and somebody pour out a pitcher, and you will tell immediately. You'll say, this is hot water. So in that way, even before you even know it, when something is off, like shadows. And so having the people develop the capability, the technology, the coding capability of being we can at later and later periods in the storyboarding process do something like applying shadows really matters. That's the mundane thing. The mythic thing is we're storytellers, emotional resonance, playing with these archetypes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I also want to call out something that you're hinting at, which is also the fact that you do this both in what your clients, and in this case, the people watching those films can see, but also in a way that your employees get to experience. And there's full alignment I think I just want to, that's something that's really central to our practice in Cosmic Centaurs, which is that's why we call it omni-channel organizations. It's a very technical term, but it's this idea that it must be coherent to whoever experiences it, whether they're experiencing it as your customer, your beneficiary, your audience member, or whether they're experiencing it as your employee, your supplier, your collaborator.
Yeah. And you actually save energy, because when we encounter dissonance, our brains actually spend quite a lot of energy and time being like, what is this thing that I'm at? And if we can't name it, it bothers us even more, right? And so I think there's actually a cost to incoherence. There's a cost to being, not omni-channel, right? So there's a very pragmatic, for me, utility to building in increasing coherence, because you're not bleeding off, energy at the edges of your work by having your people, wandering around being like, why is this the way it is? And having back channel conversations and imploding little things off the side because they either want more coherence or they're experiencing too much incoherence, or and I've seen a lot of strange behaviors in organizations.
That's a really great point about how creating that omni-channel piece, or just coherence amongst all these elements, is a very pragmatic, efficient solution to a lot of things. And actually, it resonates with a question from the audience as well, who had a beautiful instinct about it. Maybe you want to resonate with that, about how potentially focusing on both the mythic and the mundane contributes to creating a more resilient organizational culture.
Yes, it does. Part of the reason why is because when people are knocked off center, like resilience is partly defined as your ability to recohere, right? To come back to a place from which you can move, right? And not be stuck in a frozen dissonance, fight, freeze, flight, fawn is the last one. So I study a lot of it at the somatic level of like what happens in terms of resilient people and resilient organizations. And so because so much of that is based on trust and based on connection, right? More coherent, resilient organizations that have an ability where there's alignment between the mythic and the mundane, where they get a sense of being held by both, right? Have an ability, if you feel a bit held by both, to come back to center. And from center, we make better decisions. From center, we're more relational. From center, we have better access to imagination. We don't fall into patterns of isolation, abandonment, unregulated moral outrage, which is some of what happens when we're knocked off center.
Yeah.
And so this is the ground and horizon thing. Like, you need enough ground that you're not stuck, but you need it to stand on and move from. And we need enough horizon so that we have a sense of what we're moving towards, and moving towards collectively, that there's something that's shared that holds us, and that there's momentum and not hopelessness and resignation and despair and stuckness. That's what we need that shared horizon for. But you have too much only horizon, and then you just end up with nothing getting done, because it's a bunch of dreamers. They're all out there, and people are flittering around and nothing gets done. So
and I do really agree that, we were talking a little bit about this earlier, and you mentioned it as well in your talk around the level of uncertainty that we're living in the world today, geopolitics alone, not to mention AI and all the other things that are making our future difficult to predict. I do think that there's something very beautiful about that centerpiece, which is that there's not much that as leaders we can reassure people about, but we can definitely reassure them about who we are and how we do things and what our culture stands for, because that's entirely under our control, unlike so many of the other elements of work life. And I do think that being able to create that center is part of our role in order to create a place from which people can just find a bit of sanity and certainty.
Yeah. If you think about, where do you find resilience? Where do you find grace in your own lives? Often it's relationally,
Yeah.
Often it's in the people that you care about and the people you trust, because they have a degree of predictability,
Exactly.
And that matters. That matters in an era where we can feel so distracted and dispersed and disconnected, right? Human connection. This that in the United States, we're experiencing this epidemic of loneliness, and the impact on personal resilience is vast, and the healthcare cost of it is enormous. And so, like again, this is the very mundane, autoimmune stuff of the sense of alienation of aloneness, which also lives in the mythic and then plays itself out at the level of people's nervous systems.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I want to take us also to talk about strategy. You very beautifully represented this idea that you both have to have a vision, but also allow for emergence, right? Because no one can predict the future. And so while having a strong sense of direction is essential, it's also important to create space for other things to emerge. And I'm curious as to, I want to talk about, structurally, tangibly, within a team, that's somewhat easy, right? Like you control, it's so easy to create that space. When you're in a bigger organization, when you're in the hundreds and the thousands, are there structural elements that enable an organization to be able to do both the emerging strategy and the visionary one?
Well, part of it's how you resource what teams for what too, right? Like a lot of organizations that are large scale have innovation labs where their job is to pay attention to what's going on, and they have labs, like they have whole practices around risk mitigation. They've got whole practices around relationships, like large organizations, and I've got clients with this, literally have people whose job it is to have relationships with governments in order to have a close pulse check about what might be coming down the pipeline, because it'll impact things like their supply chain, different changes in policy. Right now, tension between the United States and China, has significant implications for a lot of industries. And not least in the apparel space. So being able to allocate resources for that, and this is part of why I said you need slack, right? Like if you imagine fabric, a fabric that is really tight has no ability to absorb anything because there's no give in that fabric, right? So you need some slack in the system. You need some redundancy. And so while organizations are always questing to be more efficient, do more with less, you actually need some to deal with complexity. So structurally, that time needs to get built in. And that's also part of why you need relational time, because that same slack needs to exist. Like if you are suddenly dealing with bad news or a shift in relationship or a dissonance where one group is trying to do X thing and another group is trying to do Y thing, and they're fundamentally charged with different things. The classic sort of example of this is like the sales people who go out and sell things, and then the product people are like, no, we're, there's a built-in inherent natural tension between those groups, right? You want that to be constructive tension, not warfare. Like I consulted to a large chain of breweries where there was an actual like war between their chief marketing officer and their chief supply chain officer, and it did not like, and the people under them got entrenched and into encampments, and it fundamentally resulted from an interpersonal misunderstanding, and they had not taken the time, because everything about the business was putting so much pressure on them to go fast, to build the kind of relationship that could tolerate the kind of dissonances that would allow them to be able to have a shared view of what's going on in their environment and respond to it in ways that are aligned. And so a lot of organizational energy got just wasted in the internal warfare between the two of them. And that was actually what I was brought to the CEO. I was like, I'm so over this. Please make this stop. They are both capable, competent people. I don't want to lose either of them. They've built amazing teams, and this dynamic it's a very large organization.
Yeah, I'm going to cite here an article which will link for everybody in the comments. It's old. It's from 2000. I mean, old. I don't think it's old. For some, it might sound old. It's from 2003, from Gary Hamel and Lisa Valikangas. It's called "The Quest for Resilience," and it talks a little bit about how to create, whether it's that resource allocation piece, the slack, the optionality within organizations, which is what makes them resilient. And I'm going to share a completely like one of those, like I call them, Marilyn facts, which are things that my brain remembers for no good reason. But,
I love
I really love what you spoke about optionality. And a few years ago, we were doing research for a workshop on resilience for the CEO of a global company in the midst of the pandemic. And I discovered this financial indicator called the Altman Z-score. And it's an indicator that, like, analysts and people looking at companies and trying to assess their viability. So it's a model that actually was designed in the 60s, but it's a model that predicts whether a company is likely to collapse or thrive in the next 2 years. And one of the three things, so obviously it looks at margin, revenue, all these typical things that we know, but one of the key things it looks at, which you reminded me of, is optionality. So they call it, the ratio there is earning versus assets for those who care. I'll also link to the article about it. But what was really interesting is the slack that you're talking about, is that companies that are able to adjust to new worlds and that can thrive in the next 2 years are those that have maintained optionality. And in a world that has really pushed us to efficiency, it really requires strong leadership to maintain that. And I wonder if you have any, piece of advice, any specific practices that can kind of inspire or support leaders who are trying to be those holistic leaders with range. But a lot of whether it's, the market or even just the board or the expectation is to go towards one or the other of the sides. Like, how do you resource yourself and maintain the ability to keep the range alive?
Part of the way I do that is anchor it in the Mythic. So there's a quote, and I'll have to find the person who wrote it, but the leaders creatively transgress taboos in service of deeper values. This is this positive deviance piece that we're talking about. And this connection to deeper values, what is it that's cared about? Obviously, we care about efficiency, so you need to speak about that element. Like, efficiency matters, right? You don't, again, for 1,000 reasons, you don't want the wasted energy. In fact, part of the reason we're talking about coherence is not having, wasted energy. But the sense of like the deeper values. So if you have gotten to where you've gotten to because you've innovated in some way, and you're trying to get efficiency, what you don't want to lose is your identity in that innovation piece. And so when something like efficiency becomes at the cost of identity rather than an enhancement to it, then you start having the room at the identity story level to be able to make a case for efficiency, and we need this other thing. But you've got to draw that to those two things. You've got to yoke those two things and be able to tell a cohesive story about how those fit together. And that then becomes an invitation to be able to look at the situation in a different way. So you get a little bit out of that either or thinking that can so take organizations.
Absolutely. And to close us off, we have a question from the audience about the aperture piece, right? What you pay attention to. And it says, switching between the 50,000 feet vantage point and the 5 feet vantage point requires a lot of range and energy. How would you practically recommend leaders exercise that agility?
So that, if you put your palm out, for example, so know what it feels like in your own body, first of all, right? And so if you hold your palm out and you look just at the fingertip, right? That's the narrow focus. And then you extend, look at where the horizon line is pointing. And right now I have a beautiful view outside the window in front of me to the Pacific Northwest, where I am, to the sea and the sky, but to get that expansion in there. So first of all, know what it feels like in your own body. Know what it feels like when you actually know how to focus. Because again, I don't like, my inbox implodes every single morning and my attention is scattered across 5 things. I was thinking about this keynote today, and then I had to respond to this thing, and then I was trying to design a worksheet for something. And already, my attention is so learning to coalesce your attention first, because I would guess that is a move that is counter to what everything else is being asked of you for, right? And then I would be very selective about where you invite different perspectives in. And part of what I mean by that is like, there are people whose voices you likely respect. I mean, you wouldn't even be on this call if it weren't for the fact that you respect Cosmic Centaur. So, this is one of them. But find the voices who you respect and amplify and tune those in, because you don't need to pay attention to the everything everywhere all at once, right? You will go crazy if you do that. But be selective about the breath that you invite in. Like, you get to be your own temple. Please don't clutter it with crap or too much crap. It's some of it, is a little inevitable. But so be thoughtful about what voices you invite in, because you do have limited attention. So the cultivation of that ability to attend, and the cultivation about what you intend and deliberately invite in versus just letting it all in is really important. And so
I'm
I think having a hobby that helps cultivate that. So for some people it might be gardening, where they get to pay attention. For some other, I've got an executive who practices photography because it literally cultivates his aperture, his capacity for aperture, like literally does that. I like poetry because it puts me in a different frame of mind and it invites me into the mythic. So having a set of practices that help you hone your attention feels really important. Okay, I'll pause now. You're about to say something.
No, I was just reflecting for myself that speaks to me personally, and I'm sure it speaks to everybody listening to us, because it's become increasingly hard to know and to be able to create space for that focus and attention. And so this idea of like knowing what it feels like, reminding yourself what it feels like, because you know what it feels like, and then creating moments and even resourcing ourselves in non-work related hobbies to do it is really important. And the thing is, like, it's like exercising. It always takes a bit out of you to get there, but once you're there, you're like, oh, I need more of this every day. So I think that's a really, really beautiful kind of down-to-earth reminder to just cultivate that a little bit more.
My husband has a line in one of his poems, "Everything is Waiting for You" by David Whyte, where he says, attention is the hidden discipline of familiarity, right? And I think about this sometimes because I'm playing with my nieces or with my dogs, and we get it out in our routines, like, oh gosh, I have to feed them and I have to walk them and yada yada, and but we forget to fall into the wonder of them. We forget to fall, like, there's something about this that's just really about being in love with life itself, and letting that in. There's a great Zen koan that the differences between heaven and hell is whether you hear a bird song, right? And hell is when you have become so locked in that none of that enters your field of consciousness anymore, right? And so the ability to go out and still have your ear tuned to the sound of a bird, even amidst everything else that goes on. This is the practicing of attention being the hidden discipline of familiarity, in the most mundane of your day-to-day.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that invitation. I'm sure it's going to resonate with everybody who's listening to us, and I'll be more mindful about making sure that I don't forget to hear the birds this weekend when I go to the park with my daughter. But I think it's a beautiful reminder that most of our joy lives in those moments. It just depends how we choose to experience them. Thank you, Gayle. I really appreciate what you brought to us and to everybody who tuned in today. It's really a space for reflection and for intention setting, and I'm very grateful for that.
Oh, I'm grateful for you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. And to all our attendees, of course, whether you're joining us here live today or whether you're watching this later on, be it on YouTube, as a podcast, on our website, we're grateful for your time and your space. As you all know, we still have a few more virtual sessions coming up this week. We have 3 more, to be precise. On Monday, we're going to do a redo of Matt's session, which was cut short yesterday by a worldwide downtime of our streaming platform. So Matt has agreed very kindly to join us again on Monday to restart the session that we had planned together, focusing on how leveraging polarities can help leaders and teams manage their energy and deliver sustainable performance. On Tuesday, there will be 2 sessions, one that I'll be delivering, where actually I'll be talking a little bit about it's an echo, Gayle, to what you spoke about today, but to how polarities show up in organizations through strategies, through culture, and through structure as well. With, you know, I tend to sit more on the like MBA professor persona of this, you know, so I'll be giving you guys frameworks and strategies and little drawings, you know, that you can reuse. I'm a big framework person, so that's what you'll get out of that session. And then to close it off, also on November 19th, next Tuesday, we'll be joined by one of my mentors, Professor Jose Santos, who's joined us every year for the closing of the Cosmic Conference. And we'll be discussing when polarities don't work, when we actually have to sit on one side of the extremes, just by way of having a, you know, complete intellectual view on this approach. Thank you all once again for being with us, and we hope to see you at the next one. Voila.
Voila.